Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to this spectacular venue. Oh, it's a bit loud. I think I should start with two disclaimers, I'm afraid. The first one is that when I signed up for this conference, I expected it. I wasn't aware that it would be so much on TA practitioners. I've done research work on technology assessment and participatory procedures in the past, but this is not really what my paper is about here. The second disclaimer is that this is very much work in progress, so I will not answer the question that was put up, but hopefully provide some inputs for discussion. Okay. This is a paper I'm co-authoring with Ingrid Metzel from the University of Vienna. And to give you a little bit of background about this, this comes out of an EU cost network. I don't know if you're familiar with this funding scheme, but it's a funding scheme where you can get money to do network activities. So there's no real research time involved, but you bring people together to discuss or sort of to create synergies out of what people are doing anyway. So we've been running this for a number of years now. It's called Bioobjects and Their Boundaries, Governing Matters at the Intersection of Science, Politics, and Science. And we have coined this term to sell the projects of bioobjects, which we define as a sort of an encompassing category that seeks to capture various features of a range of novel products of the life sciences and how they interact with society. And now, since there's no research time, so there's no overarching research framework, we were faced with the question of how can we work with this on the basis of what we've done already. And when we talk about bioobjects, we're talking about, we understand them as sort of fluid entities. When they're not really fixed defined, we're not saying this is a bioobject and this is not a bioobject, but they're sort of things in the making, which is why we've increasingly taken up an interest in what we call bioobjectification. So how these things are made into being. And common to a lot of them is that they challenge conventional categories, such as the distinction between nature and culture and human and animal and science and politics, which I think is very much in line with a lot of the discussions that I've overheard in the panels here. So what we were discussing was what we're interested in was how are these bioobjects and processes of bioobjectification, how are they governed? So when we came together in this network, we were faced with the challenge, how can we analyze this governance, and how can we do this in a comparative perspective so that we can learn from our different case studies, even though they're not conceived in the same framework, but sort of bringing a variety of materials together. So we're looking at ways to compare across political, institutional, and national context, but also across different technological domains. And if we're really ambitious, then also to study temporal dynamics. How does governance of these things evolve over time? And so that's sort of the substantive questions that we're interested in. And then what more specifically what we're doing in this paper is to ask some conceptual questions, is how can the governance literature assist research in STS, science and technology studies, where we have our different, we all come from different backgrounds, but this is sort of the field where we're brought together. And we make two claims in this paper. The one, you'll have to take at face value. The other is something I'm going to try to substantiate a bit more. But the first thing is sort of a bit of soul searching among STS scholars, because we feel that on the one hand, STS research is divided between some sort of grand narratives of megatrends or epochal change. So we have these discussions on biopower, neoliberalism, a change from mode 1 to mode 2, etc. And we're sort of skeptical about this, whether this really applies uniformly. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a lot of sort of very detailed case studies in the tradition of laboratory studies. We study patient groups, we study public participation, etc. And then often the bigger picture sort of gets lost. And our point is that there's a lot of interesting dynamic and variation going on at what we would call a meso level, where political institutions operate in practice, and this is where governance plays out. And this is also, I guess, what a lot of TA practitioners are experiencing when when I hear the discussions here, you have all sorts of variation across national contexts. The other claim is that, what we'll try to substantiate, is to bring STS research into a dialogue with political science and the governance literature. And of course, when we talk about governance, it's not very necessarily very clear or self-defined what we're talking about. We use this. There's a very nice paper by Klaus Offe who talks about governance as an empty signifier, which can be brought to mean a lot of things. And he makes a distinction between, there's sort of two ways to understand governance in the political science literature. One is to describe another megatrend, which is a move from government to governance, where we see movements from hierarchical mode of governing towards more network like constellations of different actors. So we move from something that is well ordered and simple to something that is more heterogeneous and complex. And I suppose that will also be familiar to a lot of TA practitioners, that this is actually what we engage in. You can also see governance as a set of coordinating mechanisms where we can distinguish between market, hierarchy, and network in different constellations. So we talk about new modes of governance. So there is this historical movement, but this is something that, on the one hand, it happens in the shadow of hierarchy, but it's also something that is contingent and in principle reversible. So we can have, in different settings, we can have different modes of governance playing out. And this is what we really want to study for bio objects or for products of biotechnology. So we end up with this definition of governance. And the important thing here is really that when we talk about governance, we're talking about something which is both structure and process at the same time. So we're talking about regimes. We want to compare regimes, really. And then in the paper, we sort of try to outline a number of dimensions of a governance regime, and I will briefly run through 5 of those dimensions. But I should emphasize that what we're trying to do here is a mapping device. It's not a theory of governance as such, but we say that there are 5 dimensions that we think are important if we want to do these kind of comparisons across cases. The first one have to do with what we call dominant imaginaries, and this is, of course, a concept we take from STS, where it's been developed especially by Sheila Jasanoff. So what are the kind of images that are guiding the actors that we're studying? Are they optimistic or are they pessimistic about the technologies? What are the kind of things that people want to achieve? I mean, I think it can perhaps be compared to what Pielke talked about as myths. What are the storylines that we're telling? Second dimension is who are the actors and how are the accountability structures in the fields ordered? How do the actors relate to each other? How are opportunity structures configured within these fields? Are we talking about public or private responsibilities? I think that's a very important dimension to discuss in relation to governance of new technologies. And of course, a lot of TA institutions are sort of straddling this distinction between public and private. What kind of actors are they? Third one is about the objectives and the instruments. So that's where the distinction between hierarchies, markets, and networks come in. What kind of governance instruments are actually applied? I think there's a small typo here. It shouldn't be confine or restrict. It should be confine or promote. Depending on what technological application or domain we're in, governance either seeks to promote a particular technology or it seeks to confine or restrict its its impacts on society. Then there's the question of extension. How far does the government's regime try to reach? Are they very local? I mean, for some medical technologies, we're talking of very local things in a particular laboratory or a hospital ward, and reaching up to conventions at a global scale, such as the Cartagena Convention on biodiversity, for instance. And finally, we talk about what are the sources of legitimacy that are involved in these regimes. Do they rely on democratic sources, on science, on markets? There's this whole discussion in the literature about input versus output legitimacy that we try to bring in. So what we come up with this sort of research matrix, which we boldly say this is a tool for mapping governance processes. And some central distinctions here, where are we pessimistic or optimistic about these technologies? Are we talking about public or private governance? Are they restraining or promoting? 5 minutes, that's fine. Local, global, or input-output? And since I have a couple of minutes yet, my last slide is, I've tried to fill this out for some of the empirical work I've done myself on the governance of GM food and on xenotransplantation, but this is something that makes sense when I talk about this in political science settings, but for you guys this will be known territory, I think. You'll probably be familiar with these cases. I mean, for the GM case, you have the imaginaries are very different, or they're sort of fighting in the public sphere. On the one hand, you have these technological optimists who think that, well, this will solve everything, and you have some very pessimistic views on what GM will do. In terms of access and accountability, we have a very complex interaction between, in the EU between the Commission and the biotech industry, national governments, and civil society organizations, where we would. My analysis would be that in this area we can talk about physical risk as proxy for social concerns. Yeah, I think since time is running and we should move on, I think I will just leave it at that as an example for how, of course, these case studies, whatever we want to study, and we have a series of these case studies that we're trying to compare. But of course, they need to be fleshed out more than I can do here. So I'll just leave it at that and say this is work in progress, and it's something that I'm very keen to discuss with you if any of you have an interest in this.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.